Earlier this morning, I received a random gift on my front porch, addressed to someone else. Obviously, the package had been delivered to the wrong person, so having nothing better to do, I decided to bring it to them myself, rather than to the post office, where it would probably sit for a full day before being delivered. I spent all year selfishly, purposely ignorant of other people's misfortunes, and wanted to do something kind for someone else before 2022 arrived. The package wasn't too large, just large enough to warrant placement on my porch rather than the mailbox. It was wrapped in bright red wrapping, and while I'm not all that knowledgeable of materials, festive or otherwise, it seemed rather expensive. There was a black bow wrapped around its edges, which I found odd. You'd ordinarily see green or really any other color used for Christmas gift decorations, but never black. There was no name on the gift, only the address, with resident at blank on the label. With the package carefully nestled in the passenger seat of my car, I drove to the address listed, which wasn't far at all from my house. Only a matter of 6 or 7 minutes, but still, the distance had me marveling at exactly how the package had been delivered to my doorstep. Without a name, there shouldn't have been any residential mix-up. The house sat by itself at the dip of a downwardly sloped cul-de-sac, a stoically posed, brooding thing, with 2 levels and the tiredly suburban design that you'd see in any large Midwestern town. The closest houses sat at opposite sides of the hill, quiet sentinels guarding the entrance to that slanted street. There was nothing but sidewalk and grass along its edges, and it all seemed to collectively rear towards the summit of the hill, as if in perpetual attempt to escape from that solitary home. Its yard was undecorated, and a simple wreath on the door was the only decoration affixed to the house itself. I drove slowly down the hill and parked my car along the curb. I hate it when strangers park in my driveway, so I try not to do it to others. And walked up the front path, package in hand. By this point, the sky was fairly bright, the sun risen to its zenith above the barely present clouds. The package's crimson wrapping shone brilliantly in my arms. I imagined myself looking particularly interesting from the front window. A woman holding some redly glowing box, auguring Christmas Day. I knocked 3 times in quick succession, waited for about 10 seconds, and then knocked once more. There were only sounds of nature and early winter activity around me. Birds and the softly blowing wind, and some troublesome car refusing to start a few blocks back. When someone finally came to open the door, I found myself a bit startled. I'd been somewhat immersed in the ambience of the afternoon. The opening of the door had a sort of vacuuming effect upon everything. Sound seemed to rush into the home and die there, and light behaved similarly. There was only darkness beyond the shoulders of the old woman in the gray sweatsuit. She looked at me expectantly, not saying a word, and I held out the box. Then, after an awkward pause, awkward for me at least, I added, "This was delivered to my address by mistake, although I'm not sure how. I believe it belongs to you." She looked at the box, and I'll admit that I felt a bit undignified at her lack of appreciation for the wrapping, even though I hadn't actually wrapped it myself. Aside from the strangely black bow, the paper itself was beautiful, radiantly crimson. Her eyes passed over the label, whereon she read the address, and then she nodded. I extended the box a few more centimeters in her direction, expecting her to take it, but instead she receded into her home and beckoned me in. She wasn't a frail woman, not visibly, so I didn't think there was a reason for me to enter it with it myself, but did so anyway out of politeness. As I passed through the threshold, I thought that perhaps she was lonely, and decided that the least I could do was keep an old woman company for a moment or two. She led me into a tea room and sat down in a large, plumply cushioned armchair. With an elegantly ringed hand, she gestured toward another chair, this one less comfortable looking and patently much older. Still holding the box, I sat down and tried to think of a compliment to make about her home. The room's window was almost completely closed, allowing only a sliver of light to make it through the heavy gray curtains, so I could only see the objects and area within the immediate scope of light. But the room was stuffy, and furnished in a way you'd expect an old and single woman to furnish a room, with lots of little trinkets and novelties and sculptures, many of which were deer or snowman related. Being a dog guy, I made a general positive comment about the animal theme, and she snorted, as if it hadn't been her idea, or if she saw through my attempt at pleasantness. A little unsettled, mostly by the dismal atmosphere of the room, I was about to set the box down and see myself out, but she raised the ringed hand so that the middle finger's purple jewel brilliantly caught the light and said, "You should have left the package alone, but it's now too late. Now you're here." Before I could ask what she meant, the ring's brilliance, further magnified by the subtle change in position, caught my full attention, and looking directly at it, I thought I saw something impossible. A star. Some fiery, violet celestial object burning in the center of that intensely twinkling jewel. And then in a blinding flash, the world around me was thrown back, the walls and furniture and objects melted away, and I was suddenly sitting on a seemingly boundless stretch of black, an endlessly stretching obsidian floor. And above me, awfully, shone an incomprehensibly massive star, the same violet sun I'd seen in the ring, only now scaled up enormously, a sphere of ultra-astral dominance. I suddenly felt a weight, an increasing gravitation that brought me to my knees, then bent me over so that it took all of my effort just to prevent myself from being crushed into the floor. Humbled in this position, I could only endure the mounting pressure, bear the fearsome heat, which I now started to feel as the gravity laid layer after horrible layer upon me. Just when I thought I'd succumb to the sheer gravitational force of that body's nearness and die, the weight was lifted, and the heat was lessened. Weakly, I rose to find the titanic celestial body now smoldering red, a crimson eye in the black gulf of infinite space. It burned harmlessly, at least with respect to my position, and I felt a sense of triumph swell within me, as if I'd beaten an intelligence, a sentient will or presence, not just some cosmic force. Suddenly, a beam shot forth from the planet, and I didn't even, and still won't, attempt to calculate the distance it had to traverse to reach the illimitably far-flung platform. It was like a large stairway of red light with perfectly segmented steps. Terror touched my heart at the sight of them, at the thought of ascending towards that intermittently hostile star. But I saw no other way to leave the bizarre domain. Figuring that instant stellar incineration would be infinitesimally better than being crushed to death, I began my climb. It only occurred to me halfway up those steeply inclining steps that I was truly in outer space, and hadn't yet any need to breathe oxygen. This observation led to the thought that I was in some sort of dream, or light-induced hallucinative state, if such a thing exists, but then I remembered the indomitable presence of the star's gravity, and quickly dismissed the idea. I was certain that I was awake, aware, and somewhere humanly inhabitable, at least for a time. Considering my general perception of the stairway, it should have taken me days, if not weeks or months, of constant climbing to reach the star. But no more than 10 minutes had passed when I found myself standing in its innocuously flaming surface. Considering the fact that I was still alive and unharmed, I reached toward the flickering flames with little fear, and my hand painlessly passed through them. Beyond those fiery tongues, I felt a hard but malleable surface, and stepping forward, I managed to impress upon it. It was obvious that I could reach it, whatever it was, and so with a glimpse back down the staircase, which gave a maddening impression of height, I pushed on through the star's outer layer, and found myself falling face first onto a thick, dust-choked carpet. Rolling over so that my face wasn't buried in years' worth of dust and crumbs of an unguessable nature, I found myself staring up at the old woman, whose hand was poised above me, middle finger curled so that I was reflected in the jewel's multi-edged face. More than a little startled, I scrambled up off the floor and climbed into my chair. The woman watched me impassively, although I'm sure there was a hint of amusement in her sparklingly blue eyes. When I regained a little of my composure, I asked her what exactly had happened to me, and she responded. "Years ago, my husband grew tired of unrepentantly naughty individuals. Of people who, being aware of his rules, still continued to behave wickedly, and are still expected to receive gifts during this blessed season. And while he cannot so callously punish children, he can do as he pleases with adults, and thus does. His punishment, when appropriately meted, consists of 3 tests. The first, delivery of the box. Had you opened or kept the gift, you would have been punished immediately, with an awful, indescribably excruciating death. The bow is rather deceptive. The moment you tried to unravel it, it would have wrapped itself around your wrist like a deadly viper and bitten you." I looked at the box, now sitting on a nearby end table, and involuntarily cringed. It had seemed to move, subtly, when my eyes caught sight of it. With the corners of her mouth now curled into a smile, the old woman continued on. "But you did the right thing. You brought it here. You then faced the next test of spirit. You successfully endured the gravity of your own anti-cheer. That is to say, you resisted mean-spiritedness. If you hadn't the joyful fortitude within you, you would have, of course, died. But the Christmas spirit within you triumphed, and you moved on. You mounted the stairway, climbed, and entered the benevolent heart of the beneficent giver. You returned to the mundane world." With her smile now unsettlingly broad and wickedly toothy, each one frighteningly pointed, she said, "Now the final test. Open the box. You needn't worry, the bow is now harmless, and the wrapping paper is just that, paper." Cautiously, with my hands trembling pathetically, I lifted the box and set it in my lap. The old woman gave me a reassuring nod, while still baring her wolfish teeth, and I, against my inner voice of reason, undid the bow and tore off the wrapping paper. The box beneath was an ordinary, thin-walled cardboard box, something you get from a bakery for a cake. With all the worst possibilities of its contents swirling around in my head, I opened the topmost flap and held my breath. Inside, resting on a small plate, was a pile of cookies. About 24 of them. I looked up with utter shock to the woman to find her now dressed incredibly in an elegantly formed and immaculately fitted gown, bursting with red and green and white frills. Now standing, she held in her hands a pitcher of milk and 2 glasses. She placed one glass on the table near me and poured milk into it. She did the same for her own glass, sat in her seat, and scooted it towards me. And with a breathtakingly heartwarming smile, she said, "Now for the final test. Have some milk and cookies with an old woman whose husband is presently too busy to spend time with her." And, as you've probably guessed, I accepted. I very easily passed that test. Those were some damn good cookies.